Welcome to In Session Taking Back Control. This podcast contains discussions on topics related to mental health, which may include sensitive and potentially triggering information regarding violence, abuse, addictions, and other mental health conditions. The experiences shared by our guests are personal and represent their individual perspectives. They have voluntarily agreed to share their stories with the aim of fostering understanding and awareness. The content of this podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice. It is not a substitute for seeking professional help, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a qualified mental health professional for any concerns or questions related to your health and well-being. Listener discretion is advised. If you find any content distressing, we encourage you to pause the episode and seek support from a trusted individual or a mental health professional. Thank you for listening to In Session Taking Back Control, and we hope that the conversations that we share contribute to a deeper understanding of mental health. Okay, firstly I'd like to welcome Dave to In Session Taking Back Control. Welcome to In Session, Dave.
Declan, it's always good to hear and see you, my friend. I've provided a homely background here, so we're not drowning in magnolia for anybody watching. And this is all the wonderful things that my wife organises in terms of my life.
Brilliant. Well, Dave, see, before we start, I know a lot about you. I'm sure a lot of people in Scotland certainly know a lot about you, maybe back home. But just by starting, can you just tell me a wee bit about yourself, what you do, and some of the great work you're doing?
And my background, Declan, I'm born in a County Antrim town called Lisburn, which is like a market town just about 6 or 7 miles outside of Belfast. I have yet to work out its exact coordinates from Derry, so I apologise for that, Declan. But I think the fact that sometimes you describe yourself as in terms of, and this amount of miles from Belfast, I think says something about where you grow up and the place that comes around you and how all of our environments kind of leave their fingerprints all over us. And I grew up in Lisburn, which was, I suppose, it's a Protestant, majority Protestant town. There was an army garrison based in it. It was a market town when I came there. Though if you go back hundreds of years, there were battles around the United Irishmen and things around that. So I grew up in a Catholic family in a very solidly Protestant town. It gave you some experiences and insights into things like sectarianism, like identity, like conflict, like the fear and apprehension that people have of things that are different. And I wouldn't want to dumb down my background. I was very lucky. I grew up in a house with parents who loved me. I was supported. I was the benefits of an education. I was able to get jobs at university and things. So I had a very solid upbringing, but always in the background to it. I was born in 1977. You had that kind of second half of the Troubles or conflict or whatever way you want to describe it. And it does leave fingerprints all over you. Even sometimes if you weren't personally involved in terms of a loved one murdered or somebody was put in prison or whatever the kind of thing was, you just knew so many people that were involved in things, and you knew people who got into things, and things were loud and angry. And I remember the 80s as, I suppose, politically quite bleak. It didn't seem a lot of things were kind of moving forward. But yet you're still a kid who likes to play football in the park and have kind of mates. And I was kind of, I suppose, in a strange situation where we were a Catholic family growing up in this Protestant town. So a lot of my friends growing up were Protestant. In a way that when I was later to go to high school, an awful lot of my friends there were, growing up in Catholic areas, and so the majority of their friends were Catholic. There was a kind of great unknown about what Protestants were, and also for some of my friends back in Lisbon where I grew up, maybe I was their only Catholic friend in some ways. So you had this kind of idea that even though I wouldn't say religion has been hugely influential in my life, I was born into that tradition. I received the sacraments. I had a Catholic education. I wouldn't. It's part of my identity, part of who I am, but it doesn't define me in the way that for other people they quite willingly have that. So I kind of grew up against this backdrop of a place where there was this Catholic, an orange hall at the top of my street. There were, I think, 3 evangelical gospel halls. There were 2 Protestant churches. There was a state Protestant school. Just in my little street, there was a TA barracks, a territorial army barracks. So you were kind of in this little quarter of a mile. You were surrounded by all these things that I suppose in the society we grew up were different to you. And I think in some ways that fostered a bit more of a sense of curiosity rather than fear in me when I was growing up. The idea that yeah, that like you knew what people were, you knew what their touchstones were, you knew what they were interested in. I mean, when I got my first job, I always remember working with a guy who was a lifelong member of the Orange Order, and he would always get me a lift home, and he was always very kind to me. And for him, the Orange Order was more like something that he joined for a cultural reason. It's like his dad was a member, and he joined it, and he was on sort of go out and have a march and parade, but but he was kind to me. And I other had friends whose parents were in the Orange Order and things. They would take you to football, or they would make you tea or something. This kind of idea that things were all you saw behind the music and the noise and the bombast and the things, and you saw the people. And quite often it was a bit different, I think. Though I think when we're reflecting on taking back control of people's mental health and well-being, and we'll maybe touch later on some of the individuals that I've worked with who that has got the better of, was a realising the difference between how people are in an individual dynamic and perhaps how you are in a group dynamic, and how people can get caught up in things that maybe in their heart of hearts isn't who they are, but because the rest of the group are doing it, they join in. So I was always interested in that kind of idea of groupthink, and I indulged in it myself when I was younger, in terms of the different things, So yeah, I had a solid kind of background. I went to school. I went to a Catholic grammar school. I got qualifications. I went to university in London. Didn't like it. Came back home. Took a job in a kind of a budget DIY decor. You might know up in Swilly Way. I took a job with like an Ulster version of B&Q. Worked in there and you also realise just how sometimes when people paid you money, they felt that they owed you. I always recall a Wednesday morning sitting in the back of the office, nothing was happening. And the manager came in and asked me to move one set of big Chinese slate tiles from one side of the building to another. They're massive, big, thick things. And his reason for doing that was because there was nothing happening. And then he made me move it from one side back to where it was, because he was almost kind of saying, I'm paying you to do something, make sure you're doing something. And I remember thinking that just wasn't the way that I wanted to live my life, just the whims of somebody. And there's other situations. I mean, on one occasion I answered a phone call, and there was a death threat from a loyalty organisation to the manager of the shop. And it was just, it was just these sort of things where I kind of thought, well, I'm not really wanting to stick around here. And I went across the sea, came to Stirling University with my girlfriend at the time. And my time in Scotland lasted longer than that relationship. Then we got over there, she discovered men in kilts and I was doomed. So it was like 2 or 3 weeks in, we kind of broke up. But then you're finding yourself about taking back control, because what I had done in that sense was, back then, particularly with the grammar schools, it was like you go to university or bust. That was how people saw it. And I tried university in London and didn't like it. I went back home and worked for 18 months in a full-time job. I didn't like it either. The girl I was seeing, she got into university in Stirling, and I just kind of followed. So that idea, but I wasn't actually feeling a sense of control of my life. I was following other people. I was, the whims of their decisions. And obviously we got over to Scotland, and incredible as it sounded, she might have found somebody better than me. I went around. So you're in that situation.
I don't believe it, Dave.
Thank you, Declan. That's very, very fine of you to do those kind of things. And then so you're in a situation where you're 6 weeks in a city where you don't know anybody. You don't have any friends. I was put into sort of student accommodation and things, and it was just a sort of time where I think my life could have gone in two directions. It could have been quite negative. I could have dropped out again. I could have kind of gone back to and you were tempted sometimes to go back to the paycheck, the pint on the Friday, the familiarity of home, with that. But fortunately, I decided to stay on. I made a group of friends from around the world because of the nature of Stirling University. I met my wife there. I moved on and got an opportunity to the university to get a job working in the Scottish Parliament. I did that for 9 or 10 years and then got the job with Nil By Mouth. So that's a very potted history, and that I'll be expecting, Declan, when my obituaries are published. I'm expecting all these to be mined and gleaned. And then about 2011, this opportunity came up to work for Nil By Mouth, and it was an anti-sectarian organisation. For those who don't know it, it was set up by a teenage girl called Cara Henderson, in response to the sectarian murder of her school friend Mark Scott as he went home from a football match in the city. His killer, a man called Jason Campbell, identified him by the scarf he was wearing as belonging to this kind of different tradition that, there's an us and an M, and that's the way the world is, and stabbed Mark to death in the street. And that had quite profound impacts on lots of different people. It had profound impacts, I suppose, on Cara, because it was her friend who'd been murdered. And that was a very slow burn for her, in years to come by when she was she kind of always felt a sense of trauma from that, even 10 or 13 years on from the actual event. Obviously, for his parents, devastated by it all, they set up a wonderful charity called the Mark Scott Foundation, the Mark Scott Award, and it supports leadership in young people from different areas and helps people build bridges, really wonderful causes with the Outward Bound Trust. But Nil By Mouth was set up as a campaign group, and it was set up to try and make people think about this subject of sectarianism and think about the impact of things. And what was interesting about Cara Henderson was she also wanted to consider the impact of the actions on the murder on Jason Campbell. Why did he do what he do? Like, children aren't born like this. What is poured into us? What's the journey you go on from when you're born to you commit this act? How controlling yourself were you doing it? Was there alcohol involved? What's it around it? And any study of Jason Campbell's life will tell you he was somebody who came from a place with very fixed certainties and fixed identities, and you were not allowed to move outside of those parameters of things. And that idea that's just because somebody is different to us, we have to attack it. And I think how you deal with things that are different, or what I'm interested in, we're an anti-sectarian charity. You'll get controversy, you get people complaining about it. People say you're all sorts of things. If you go online, you'll find all sorts of things. But if you're mad enough to Google yourself, you'll see all types of things that people will say. Yeah. But for me, what we want to try and do is help people better understand difference, right? I don't think equality is about everybody walking down Sucky Hall Street in Glasgow, arm in arm, singing Kumbaya and half Celtic and Rangers shirts. That's not what it's about. It's about understanding other people's rights to exist, understanding their points of view that are different to yours, understanding that it's not a frightening thing to go beyond your parameters. Not to be told, because there's a set of sort of easy answers, and particularly I think with identity politics, which was certainly seen over the last week or so as we're recording this a week after the presidential election in America. And if I think about how politics has impacted over the last 10 or 15 years, drilling down and finding issues and wedge issues that divide people and building up bases around that, that's very pertinent. You just have to switch on certain social media platforms to see people, selling a story, selling a message, selling a version of things, and they do it in such a way for clicks, likes, and follows, and building up a kind of audience and things around it. I always think it's phenomenal when you look at the social media element of things. We're talking about taking back control, that people will tell you they dislike the politics of the owner of Twitter, or they dislike what it's become, but lots of people stay there. And one of the things that I find really revealing in my work is looking at the impact of social media on our own self-worth and self-value and how we see ourselves, because there are people who may disagree with Elon Musk's politics, or they disagree with how the platform's been used, but they've got 12,500 followers, so they think, my ego won't let me go somewhere else. But really, in some ways, Twitter and social media is where your ego hangs out, where you get that kind of sense of yourself. And people try to build up movements or audiences or profiles for themselves in doing those things. So our charity tries to deal with these kind of old ideas of prejudice, sectarian prejudice, differences between Catholics and Protestants, things that are deeply historical. And there's other podcasts if you want to delve into the history of it all, and it's fascinating. But how do you deal with that in 2023? Like, it started at one place. It started with people who were willing to take life and give their lives in genuine defence of their religious faith, to now it's where people shout and chant things at football matches. It's where people go online and post sort of material. It's when people will tell you, you don't marry people like them, so they're not folk like us. You only join memberships at clubs, so there's lots of different sort of things that go around it all. And one of the things I find fascinating about sectarianism is you need to talk about sectarianism and also identity, group identity and individual identity, and how we actually take back control of our own identities and our own sense of ourselves, and who speaks for us or who doesn't speak for us, or who claims to representing us. So as an organisation, we're all about identity, and we work in schools, prisons, and workplaces, one-to-one with people. We work with sporting clubs to try and not tell people, I guess we go armed with the questions rather than the answers. So I'm not going to turn around and tell you this is the way to live your life, because you're not going to listen. But we will ask questions. We will say, have you thought about this way? What about this perspective? You just not to sow seeds of doubt in your certainties, but to try and make you just think a little bit wider too.
Do you know what? That's really, and I think probably, we had a bit of a chat beforehand. We've talked before, and so much of that resonates with me, Dave, and in particular the fact, coming from the north of Ireland myself, moving to Scotland, seeing the difference in sectarianism in Scotland compared to the north of Ireland, and the understanding of it. You mentioned kind of the going to the matches and singing songs and There's and even listening to your childhood. I mean, what an interesting childhood. I'm sitting thinking, how would my life have been, or how would my perspective have been if I grew up in that area? Because I grew up in the Brandywell / Bogside in Derry, so it's very synonymous with the Troubles. It's very well known for the Troubles. But I never met a Protestant until I was 18, till I actually went to work and went into the town. And I was working in a jeweller's, and there was a girl beside me, and she was a Protestant, and her dad owned the shop in the town. So there was all that kind of insular sectarianism that he went with. Do you know what I mean? And it was that kind of, I suppose, trying to fabricate something whenever I moved away from home, like you did, and seeing the difference in cultural understanding, that I didn't realise, one, that it was probably so messed up in what it would do to you in your childhood, and then your understanding of self and the acceptance of others as well. Do you know, and that's what you're talking about with Nil By Mouth. It's that, individualistic stuff and getting to know people, not giving the answers and asking the questions. I just find that really interesting, and it's been going since what, Evan, did you say?
I've worked for charity since 2011, Declan. The charity was set up in 2000, so next year will be our 25th, I was saying wedding anniversary, our 25th anniversary as an organisation. It's some time and effort in young women around 16, 17, which was Cara's age when she was setting it up, to find out what things they want to change in their communities and societies, and what messages they want to convey, to put into them. And I mean, I enjoy living in Scotland. But it's interesting, I was thinking recently about the idea of what is home, because obviously you refer to the north of Ireland, which I would understand. Other people refer to Northern Ireland quite pointedly. And I've always just called it home, because when I say home to you, you know what I mean. And I think that's the thing, there's people where we come from, some of them call it the north, some call it Northern Ireland, but we all call it home. And it's that idea of trying to find a degree of commonality. You won't agree at everything, and I'm not naive enough to think that, but it's trying to, how do we understand symbols better? How do we understand, like a fascinating thing is linguistically. So in Gaelic, as you and I would have known it, it's predominantly associated with Catholics in North of Ireland. I'll call it Northern Ireland at home. All right. So at home, it's associated with Catholics. Now over here in Scotland, probably the most fervent speakers of the Gaelic language are evangelical Protestants, in the Western Isles and places. So you have these situations where you're hearing these beautiful Gaelic psalms, and they're sung in the context of Protestant worship, which when I was growing up, and occasionally you'd be taken to Gaelic Irish masses and things along those sort of lines. So those sort of things are quite fascinating. And I had a sort of discussion about how symbols can be shared. So again, growing up in Lisburn, and I don't wish to talk too much about home, but we're delving into personal experiences. Like Lisburn would have had places where on the 12th of July, every flagpole would have had a Union flag on it. People would have illuminated their offices with bonfires, all the things. So the July fortnight was a big thing for the town, because it was a Protestant town, it was a Union town. That was a celebration element of it. And one of the things I always recall quite starkly were Scottish Celt that were flown around the place. I was explaining this to a prominent Scottish nationalist recently, who was aghast at the idea that as he saw Unionist areas would try to claim his flag. And I was trying to explain to him, but actually they see that as their flag. So the two of you have something, you have a symbol that matters to you, but it can mean two very, very, very different things. And maybe if Nil By Mouth's doing its jobs well, some of it's about bringing people together, but maybe some of it is translating things for people, helping people understand, that there are different cultures and traditions to your own. And the two of them will never be reconciled. And there's issues around marches and parades and things like that there's always going to be controversy around. But I think there is a way that we can manage our differences better, and realise also demographically things have changed an awful lot. Scotland is becoming more diverse, and it's not as diverse as England, but it's much more diverse than the parts. Even when I was back at home, I was home a couple of weeks ago, I was quite struck by the different sort of nationalities and skin tones and things, and even like the occasional kind of same-sex couples holding hands. And that may not sound revolutionary to listeners if they're in Scotland, but if you had told me in the 1980s that gay people could walk about Belfast without getting aggravation, I wouldn't believe it. And that's not to say they would get, that they'll be getting aggravation, and they will. But I've seen such change. I mean, I've seen Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams sit down together Now, for our younger listeners, that might mean anything, but Declan, we have a similar vintage. If I had told you back then that the Sinn Féin leader, senior figure in the IRA, Martin McGuinness, would sit down with a man who came to the Catholic school in Lisburn, and when he led a demonstration against the Anglo-Irish movement in 1985, put up a sign outside our school saying there are no fire escapes in hell. This was the level of bitterness that was there, and yet ultimately these two come together in a reasonably effective double act. So when you've lived in your life to see those sort of changes happen, it does give you great things. And even when we're reflecting on it, we're recording this a week after Remembrance Sunday, and symbols. So we're talking about the footballer from your hometown, James McLean, takes what he would regard to be a very principled stand against wearing the poppy. He doesn't do it. He doesn't do it with Bloody Sunday. And I think the reasons he gave are very reasonable for doing it. But again, people will abuse him, people will shout at him, the impact on how he feels about that. Like, he doesn't always do himself favours in terms of some of his own behaviour, but you have to respect someone's right not to do that or not to take part of it. For me, I think that was a very dignified way of doing it. He didn't want to share it, so he stood apart. He just made his point known without disrupting anybody else's right to. Perfectly legitimate way of doing it. And yet, by the same token, if you go across Scotland, where there was chanting during silence in Kilmarnock from the way of the Celtic supporters, they have strong feelings about colonialism and things like that. And then you go across the other way to Belfast, you have the leader of Sinn Féin, Michelle O'Neill, laying remembrance wreath in Belfast. So I look at these sorts of things, and they're kind of joined up at different places. Something that can be divisive to people, and how are we trying to get over that? How are we trying to explain that? And the difficulty, I think, sometimes, Declan, in the era of socials and podcasts, I'm sure I've listened back to some of your other kind of shows and people talking about the impact. Sometimes it's always, we're talking about COVID or we're talking about the socials again. But one of the things I find about social media is it encourages you to have opinions about things, whether you've really thought them through or not. Or they'll encourage you to find somebody who's done thinking for you, come out to an outcome you think's all right, and you click like, follow. And so those ideas about in social media, when these things happen, they spread quite quickly. Millions of people can view them. You pick up your phone. One of the things that, because you discussed this before, because obviously the part of this is about people's mental well-being and parts of your life where you take control. And I kind of said I never really had any mental health episodes in my life. And a period when I was physically unwell, and that impacted on my mental health. And the two were linked. As I got physically better, my mental health improved. That was thankfully more understandable. But there are times when I used to always joke to people that, when you're going up through the troubles, you didn't worry about Twitter. That was the thing. And then there was an incident regarding football where charity had spoken out about things. And I think when I went to switch on my phone, it was thousands of comments, not all,
right.
Abuse around it. There were people that were emailing funders to complain about things. There were people that reported us to Oscar, the charity regulator. There was a real assault on the charity because we had taken a stand in a position that certain people didn't agree about. And it was shared through social media, and it was amplified by people looking to say, get into these folk and get round to them. And I must confess, I went to bed that night and it almost felt like about 12 or 13 hours just switched on your phone, drowning in toxic abuse. And the thing is, you say you switch your phone off, but it isn't that easy because you've got to pick your kid up from school. You've got to pay bills on your phone.
That's it.
So you use your phone for so many things. So I can't just switch it off and ignore it. All these kind of things. You need to have connection. And all you just saw, I had to try to disable all the notifications. I almost found myself dreading to look at it. I almost went to bed that night, and there was one night where I thought, what, see, tomorrow morning I'm going to look for another job because this isn't just worth it. And it was really quite depressing, and it was quite. It just, you sort of feel within yourself that you shouldn't, it's just cyber stuff. You shouldn't worry about it. And I've known people who've been murdered in cold blood. I've met people who've lost loved ones. You've seen the real harsh side of hatred, and you think, I can't be getting upset about people posting things in the socials. But when so much antipathy is targeted towards you, it's never pleasant. And one of the reflections I was having, I have worked with a number of people who have lost jobs and careers because of the things they've posted online, whether they've been filmed singing, and these things could be sectarian or racist, whatever the case may be. Well, we're never looking to defend them because you post these things. It's astonishing the amount of folk. We have met people who, when you meet them, their mental health is south of Australia, because they've posted something and these things are quite generic. They're nasty. They're not directly targeted towards someone. They add to the kind of toxic stew around it, but it's not like they're emailing somebody in that way. And you kind of realize that there's massive consequences for them in terms of their mental health and the mental well-being and how they recover from that, and what is the support mechanism around them, and how, that there's this kind of thing where so much self-worth now. Like I said, I'm 47 now. A lot of our work with people in their 20s and 30s, but see people in the 18s, early 20s, they've only known socials. That's the only word that they know. It's a remarkable currency for them in terms of how they view themselves, from the filtering process that you kind of use to the amount of followers that you kind of have. So I met somebody who posted a tranche of sectarian messages that cost her job, right? And she came to see with me after this had happened. She'd been struck off by her professional qualifications. She'd lost her job. My mum actually phoned me from Belfast to say she was on the front page of the Belfast Telegraph because of what she posted. So it was that kind of sensation. And I remember sitting with her and thinking, she was didn't go, well, that's there's axis of consequences, and that. But you sat and listened to her, and she was destroyed because what she had thought was, she thought it was all a game. And this mix of passion, pantomime, and poison that is sectarianism, the passion, genuine passion for your identity, things that you believe in, your causes. Pantomime of thinking it's just a joke. So do a football match, do a game, it's just a laugh. It's not real, it doesn't happen. But the poison that's in there, that how people hear it, how people receive it, and why you're kind of doing it. And she just said it was all pantomime, it was all a joke, I didn't mean it. And actually, in some ways I believed her. In other ways I kind of thought, see, if you hadn't been caught, you'd still be posting it today. And so you work, some of my most interesting work has been supporting people who have actually been very sectarian in terms of the actions and behaviour, and trying to piece together why they've behaved in the manner that they have, and helping them. And I'll go back to again, how do you take back control of a situation where you become the middle of a social media shitstorm? And sorry for you, that's what you become the middle of.
You can swear, it's fine.
Oh, good. Well, I went with the dairy man. I'm all right. Those things you understand, but I apologise for that. But you meet people whose lives, and sometimes what happens is somebody becomes a Twitter troll and posts things, and then we all say, oh, stupid person, they've got their sanctions, and we all walk away and wait for the next one to happen. That person still has to deal with that sort of situation. Or if people get arrested for sectarian offences, religiously aggravated offences, racism, whatever the kind of things are, every time they go to apply for a job, you Google their name and that comes up. And that's part of someone's story. That's something that they have to explain to each other. So that fact that social media, I think particularly with these identity issues, they give you access to the other side 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. People will be able to go and provoke folk or pick arguments. I mean, you'll go on things like Christmas Day, classic in the UK and Ireland, the kind of day of rest, and people will still be tweeting and posting things and around it. And so those sorts of things, that sense about from bots that are out there to real people who genuinely, because there are they're bots and machines, but there are genuinely people who just spend their day churning out things in the socials because they want you to look at them and they want their attention. And if you look, for example, at how Donald Trump has won the White House now, there's a template for how you get people's attention. He bypasses the mainstream media completely, goes onto social media and broadcasts in your hand, in your pocket for you to look at it without people asking all the awkward questions. So on every sort of issue in life, the phones have become these old battles and these old grievances have found new playgrounds and new ways of doing them. And it can be exhausting keeping up with them all, and it can be exhausting kind of being on the receiving end of it. And I always felt like I think of two young, early 20s young people that I work with, and one of them targeted a footballer, and the other one was more generic sort of stuff. And like I remember one day, like a mum coming into the office for one of them, and she was very, very upset. And I asked her what was wrong, and she's like, "My boy was lifted. What's he done?" And she showed me the message, and it was pretty, it was sort of thing. And I remember saying, well, what's going to happen? And can you come and speak to them? Can you come and speak to the police? She was just desperate. She was just absolutely desperate for someone to come in, step in and set it out. And I was saying, well, what does he do for a living? She goes, why does that matter? And I go, well, do they have a social media policy? Can he be linked to it? But it didn't happen at work. And it doesn't matter. Like if you go on his LinkedIn profile and he's there, you've done this, they'll sack him. You have to be prepared for that. And it was just different watching this woman who'd obviously tried to do a good job bringing up her kid, loved her kid, watching her kid. And what was really terrifying about it was that idea that you could be like sometimes people used to be like growing up during the Troubles, Dag. I don't know if it was the same with your own family, but Like, I know I must have been at least 40 when I would come. The first time I come home, my mother would be in bed, because like if I used to go out when I was in my teens or 20s, my mom would stay up. And I remember I used to drink in Belfast, and there was a club called the Crescent Arts Centre. It was the Crescent nightclub, and it was on Sandy Row, and it was home to where the Shankill Butchers, who were quite a notorious loyalist band, paramilitary group, had carried random sectarian murders, which was before my time. So you're still going through the 90s and these things. And I remember going to the nightclub, and it was just like, it was a nightclub, and we met girls from our schools. It was fantastic. It was great. But I would never, I think to this day, my mother doesn't think that I went there, because she wouldn't let me go, even though it was around the corner from Lavery's where I normally went, because it was in her head that that was a place that was dangerous. She wouldn't go in. And so even just things like in her 20s and 30s, my mom would, I must have been about 40 by the time I would come back home if I was staying and mum was in bed. I don't know if because it was that idea the kids didn't come home, and things did happen. And then fast forward to Scotland 2024, and your mother's in tears because what's happened is the kids are at home, but they've got their phones out and they're playing and they're sending people messages. And in this case, because the way they're all tagged, she could tell me that he was actually in the house with her at the time she was making dinner, and he was sitting in the front room on his phone. It's like, if I'd just known, I'd taken that phone off and I'd flushed it down the toilet. So that thing that they can be sitting in the room with you, but actually virtually somewhere else, it's quite I know I've got one son, he's 7, and he's wanting to play Roblox at the minute, and I'm terrified about it, because it's probably just a daft game, but it links you in with the outside world. There's message rooms, you can play with his friends, and it's a terrifying prospect to come into. So all these things are an identity. There's all these new weapons and tools that people can use to agitate, and also, I think, to shoot themselves in the foot, because the consequences are actually a lot more serious for them than they almost are for community relations.
Aye. And I think you've touched on 2 points there, and I think my head went to 2 different points, because when you were talking about, Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley, and that, they were synonymous for being called the Chuckle Brothers. And I mean, something I would never have envisaged, because I grew up in the Brandywell, grew up beside Martin McGuinness. He used to take me swimming with his 2 boys and stuff, and I always wondered why my mum wasn't keen on me going out with him in the car and stuff. I didn't realise later on in life that he had to check for bombs underneath the car before he took us out on a Wednesday night going swimming. So I now realise why her anxiety was so amplified. But going from that in my childhood to seeing that transformation politically, which I was a huge supporter of, that kind of coalition. And then nowadays, because you talked about going back home and there being a different feel, a different demographic in the town and Belfast City, and seeing, different, because, and you mentioned skin tones. It's something I would never have seen growing up, was someone with darker skin, brown skin, black skin. It was very, very rare when I grew up in Derry, certainly. But now again, like you, when I go back home, I see different demographics, different backgrounds and cultures, and it's fantastic to see, and it's massively embraced. So part of me was thinking, do you think there has been almost a generational and I'm talking about back home and Scotland. So do you think there's been a generational dilution of sectarianism because of that kind of cultural impact and more people coming in? Or on the flip side, do you think there's been, has it been accelerated because of the social media, the stuff you talked about? So what is your organisation in Nil By Mouth seen?
Say that there's less sectarianism in Scotland now than there was. But what's interesting is, I think there's more avenues for it to be highlighted and amplified and explored and challenged in some ways. So I think there was issues, because it's an interesting phenomenon, because obviously where we're from, Declan, areas of places are quite clearly geographically defined as being either Protestant or Catholic. That language is changing now, I think, a lot more towards nationalist and unionist. And I think what we recognise as sectarianism, we think of that in our religious terminology, the difference between Catholics and Protestants. Now, rightly, for good or for better or for worse, there's about 40% of the population will still tell you they've got a faith in Scotland. I think it's about 20% of them are Church of Scotland, and around 14 are Catholic. And there's other smaller religions and things, and different outside of Christianity. So about 40%. But I would estimate, looking at some figures and trends, fewer than 5% of these people who regularly go to a place of worship. Now, if you go on to the Church of Scotland website, there's like 14 pages of property that they're selling. You go on Instagram, you can find any goodness amount of like church conversion accounts where people are converting old churches into houses and things. The Catholic Church reported that after COVID, there was a massive drop in terms of congregations coming and people coming to churches and coming into it. I am not saying that is a good thing or a bad thing. Personally, for me, I think there's a lot of positives in faiths. And I think at that official level, I think Catholic priests and Church of Scotland ministers have never been closer than they are now. There's so much interfaith work goes on. And partly that's fear of secularism, because they see Scotland becoming more secular. And I think that's the same thing back at home. And their influence waning and the values that they hold waning, and they're scared about it. They really are scared about it. There's been attempts to remove the Church of Scotland from a lot of local authorities in terms of the church representation education committees. There's the age-old discussion around Catholic education. Now, on the record, I'm a fan of choice in education. So if you choose to send your kids somewhere, that should be the case of it. I think if you recognise there's those different systems, and that can generate tensions between, there's ways you can go in and work and kind of de-escalate that. So I'm not actually an advocate of doing away with faith schools. If I'm honest, I think that'd be quite a progressive measure. But there is that kind of idea that I think at that kind of ministry level, they're close, they're tight, because they have to be. And I think part of the challenge now is that secularism now. So at home, when we're talking about it, increasingly people talk about nationalist Republican or unionist loyalist. That's how they kind of use those things. So we're almost entering into that almost secular age of sectarianism, where it's actually now more about your ethnic ideas or your constitutional beliefs rather than your faith-based. However, when you would do an analysis of it, you'd find most of the people would have been brought up in that faith tradition. And so the roots are kind of there. And I think what we're going to see is a form of mutation, a shift towards things like that. So you'll have people say, well, what's the point of having a sectarian charity? Because it's not about religion. It's about, you need to separate race and religion and ethnicity. And all these things are legitimate debates to kind of have. And so what I think you're finding now are old rivalries finding new battlegrounds. And that could be over things like your position on the Middle East, your position on Scotland's constitutional things. And the roots of those things still lie within that kind of religious division. Although you wouldn't really find places now that would be, this is a solid Catholic street, or those things just don't really happen in Scotland now. You still got towns and places that have reputations, but Scotland's Catholics and Protestants are pretty much in every key indicator kind of fairly level pegging. And indeed, when you go back to home, Catholics I think are twice as likely to go to university as Protestants. So you've had this kind of difference, but within those kind of societies and within those kind of demographics, I think there's a kind of status anxiety. Where in Scotland, where increasingly you have a Catholic middle class that is thriving and is vibrant and things around it, but still that kind of sense that you're somehow underdogs and somehow discriminated against. And of course, some people have, but it's that thing that the evidence doesn't always support that. People will pick little things with prison populations and stuff, but I'd like to see that all properly kind of tested. You see a lot, to get something from it, because most of them, like Tom Devine, for example, Scotland's most eminent historian, would tell you that we're in the death rattles of sectarianism now. That it's actually, and he made a point which I think was perceptive in some ways, where he said, look, it's interesting that this has been looked at now towards its death rattle when it wasn't for those hundreds of years, when it was something quite potent, Right. But we still live it, and the history doesn't. And it's the same thing when we're talking about, like, history is not just one blank sheet of paper. If we were to designing, say, a system around education or marches or football, whatever it is, maybe we wouldn't design what we have now. But that's not the kind of world that you're given. For some of us, history begins when we arrive, and we can only make sense of the world that way. But all these structures exist, and you can't just rub it out and start again. There's nothing, because people would crack up, people would be angry, people would dispose it. Yeah. And so these things about how we kind of manage a history, and we manage a history when religion was very prominent in our lives, to actually the point where now it isn't. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a true reflection. Religion is, if we were designing a society now, would we have a prominent role for faith? Would you have, archbishops in the House of Lords? Would you have faith schools? Maybe you would. Faith schools would you permit things like the Orange Order to kind of march? Maybe you have. Maybe you wouldn't. It's just, but you can't just wipe out all those things. Those things exist, and in people's heads, these are a big part of people's identities and what they want. And then also, while you're promoting your identity, there's how people react to it, and how much of your identity is about celebrating who you are, or how much of that is about just antagonizing somebody else because they're different to you. And sometimes I kind of find, and again, like the key of this thing is about trauma. The society that you and I grew up in is speeding societal-wide trauma. There's no other word to describe it. Thousands of people were killed, thousands of people lost their lives in a small place, the footprints. The street I grew up on used to have security barriers, yellow security barriers at the night, because there was a paramilitary bombing, ironically, in my street that kind of blew up a TA barracks. And, they tried to close it off with a ring of steel. I mean, you're talking about, the Brandywell and places like that. You go back to the very start of the Troubles, people there felt physically besieged.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you don't know people from a background, because there's that sense of being surrounded and done in. My own father comes from the West Belfast and Cavendish Street, and he would talk about when people were burnt out of their homes and burnt out of their houses. Lisburn, where I lived, in a historical context, I was reading a wonderful book about it by Glenn Patterson, and there was a police officer killed in the corner of Margaret, which was old Shannon's the Jewelers, and this caused in 1910, somewhere around there. This caused effectively the Catholic population of Lisburn to be burnt out, and people literally walking with like almost, he described seeing people literally walking with all their possessions and walking to Belfast, 8 miles up the road, to kind of stay with family and find somewhere to go. And these things are within living memory, and parts of the things, there's a temptation sometimes if you meet young people now who are in their kind of late teens and 20s, and it's always tempting. They start telling, this is what happened. And you think, well, were you there? But then you've also got to remember, they may know very well know somebody who was there. This is within living memory that these things happened. I mean, there wasn't one person, one vote for local government elections back at home until like the 70s and things. So all these things are really parts of the fabric. And I think about it, about like how you take, a lot of it's about how you take back control of who you are and labels that people attach to you. So, you get, for example, controversies with the term Fenian. That's an interesting one, because that is normally about people seen as a sectarian term. You can be charged for racial or religious intolerance for whatever the case is under the new hate crime laws. But there are also people, and you think of Patrick McCord, for example, from your hometown, who Celtic fans would sing Paddy McCord's Fenian Army, because they see it as a positive term, because the history of the term was about this sort of warrior tribe that lived apart, and the Irish Republic. Right. And yet, to me, if you use the word Fenian towards me, because of the context I grew up in, it only means you're looking for a fight or an argument or to provoke something. So these things about how we kind of control language and control words, and actually what we say to somebody may not be how they receive it. That's a real fascinating kind of facet of all these kind of works and things that come around to it, So, I mean, for me, I think there's been a lot of progress over the last 20 or 30 years. I think there's a rise in things like mixed marriage, because that's still an issue, marriage. I mean, I've had a woman sit down in my office and break down in tears, and I asked her what's wrong. She said, I'm getting married in 6 weeks, and my dad won't walk me down the aisle because I'm marrying someone from a different religion. And I can give you statistics for the amount of sectarian words on Twitter. I can take you to show you A&E words and things that might happen to it. I can't tell you how many relationships hit a full stop. How many people were looked up and down because they didn't give a right answer to what school did you go to. That sense and that impact, that genuine human impact that it has on people, Declan, can last generations. So if you're from somewhere like Derry and you've got a great uncle who died on Bloody Sunday, you're going to be fucking angry. You're going to be angry. If you were somebody like in my hometown in Lisburn, there were six British soldiers murdered in a car bomb explosion in 1988. Now, if you're their kids, you're going to clutch. You're going to be fucking angry. And even you're the grandson, because someone has done something to a member of your family, and you don't feel that that's been dealt with correctly. And because of the connections between Ireland and Scotland, because I think it's around 1 in 4 people in Scotland within 2 generations have family from where we come from, or from the south, or wherever, from the island. Those things matter to people. So It's important we don't patronise people with their identities. That does mean, just because I grew up in the island of Ireland, I grew up in Northern Ireland, so I have a sense of the troubles and what happened and went on there. So I have a sense of that. It's left its fingerprints over me, as you said, it's left your fingerprints over you. But by the same token, that doesn't give me a monopoly on suffering. That doesn't give me the only experience with it. If I come over here and say your family are second, third generation, you've been away from that 150 years, be that from a Protestant tradition or a Catholic tradition. And it can be tempting when you start telling me this is the way it is to say, well, actually it wasn't, and I was there. But just as they can't have my experience, I can't have theirs. And so that idea, I mean, there's a fascinating sort of program. You see projects like Beyond Remembered Srebrenica and things where people show that when humanity collapses on itself, our capacity to torture each other because we're different. And often I've kind of wondered, it's a good charity and it brings kind of opinion formers over from different parts of Scotland. I remember a couple of years ago meeting them, so would you be interested in taking people from Orange and Republican traditions over to do this? And they're a wee bit, they were sort of interested, but they were kind of like, well, we're looking to kind of inform opinion. I thought, well, let these folk go around together and experience things. There's a fantastic thing, an artist called Roddy Buchanan, and I recommend anybody checks him out. He does wonderful work, Roddy, and he did this wonderful thing. It was in Derry, or Londonderry for other listeners, just in case people think that I have any preference with that place. But he does a wonderful thing when they go back for the parades in Londonderry, Derry. And what they would do is he took like a loyalist plan back and he took a Republican plan. They just walked about. They weren't all together. And what he did was he took photographs of the bands, the Republican Flute Band and the Orange Band, and he gave them pictures, something akin to how you would go into like, say, West Point in America. You would go in and see these kind of photographs of people in uniforms. And he took them in kind of positive lights. And I think it was the National War Museum in London did it. I know it was in Glasgow and Edinburgh for a while. And he's like, on this issue, he's brilliant. So I recommend, if you're interested about those sort of Catholic, Protestant, Irish, British identities in Scotland, check out Roddy Buchanan's work, because he's just such a gifted artist. And he took these photographs and hung them up, and it was almost like they were regimental portraits or something, but they were positive. Mm-hmm. What he was trying to say was, look at these people in the manner that they see themselves in. Look at themselves, how they see themselves as, spokespeople for their communities. They see them as continuing a tradition. They see it as with values. Because I've met people who have, I would think, quite sectarian attitudes, but they still love their children. And maybe they pass on messages that I don't agree with, but I could never doubt their love for their child, because they genuinely want that. I think that, like, identity can be given to you as a gift, but also a curse. Not to go all WB Yeats on you. In some ways, but that kind of idea about, our identities mean something to us. So you and I, Declan, we are two guys from where we're from, and from my point of view, and I won't pry into yours because it's a personal thing. I personally don't tell my son he's Irish. Right? I don't tell him he's Irish because he's born in Scotland. Mm-hmm. Mother's Arcadian. He knows that I'm Irish. We go back home. He visits his family over there, but that's not the story that I tell him, because there's a part of me that I'm to write a story. That doesn't mean 10, 15 years. He may wish to know more about it or may embrace it, but that's not what I tell him. Now, would you like to say how you would deal with that with your child? Maybe you don't. I know it's putting you a little bit on the spot. How would you deal with that?
No, well, I'm happy to say, because it's, I suppose for me, when we're talking about the connection as well, and the marriage between, Catholicism and Church of Scotland and all these kinds of things. And so I actually married someone who's Protestant. So I was married in the Church of Scotland, church, which, again, something historically probably would have been massively unknown of. If you had asked me, would that have happened if you asked me my 18-year-old self, my 16-year-old self, who was full of angst and frustration and vigour about what was happening in the world, I probably would have said absolutely no chance that would happen in my future. But I think as you go on and you evolve and you grow, I actually met my wife in Derry, believe it or not. So she was over for a girls' weekend in Derry, God love her, and she got stuck with me. So we travelled back and forward. I moved to Scotland, got married in Church of Scotland, and my mother and family very.
I just love the thought of you sitting waiting at Derry Airport for hen nights and girls' night, waiting to arrive, waiting to descend with your charm. And I'm going to be careful. I must ask your wife how many times that you were spotted in that vicinity in the time to come.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question, Dave. But I didn't meet her in the airport, I have to be honest, but I have frequented their airport more often than not. It was actually in Para O'Donnell's I met her. So, and again, that contingent of her friends were a really mixed group, of different Catholic and Protestant. So, and it was one of those things at that age, as I was older, I wasn't really thinking about religion, wasn't even thinking about, it was more about the person. So that's why getting married in the Church of Scotland didn't bother me. And it didn't actually bother my mother, my family to actually come over to the Church of Scotland and celebrate that marriage. What was interesting though, is we were that our marriage was celebrated by both a priest and a minister. So we had a joint celebration where we had a priest and Church of Scotland minister who both celebrated the marriage. Ironically, the priest was formerly a minister of Church of Scotland and converted to Catholicism. So, and it was amazing, that collaboration, because there was parts that the priest had taken a point, doing the, lighting of the candles and all that kind of stuff. And they worked so well together. And the one thing that became really evident, that there's really no difference. There's very little difference whenever you boil it all down. And I think there was parts that the minister actually had taken from that celebration, which she'd never experienced before. And actually she had said, I'm going to use this going forward in the marriages that I celebrate, because I really like this part of it. So it was quite nice, to have that kind of collaboration. I know you asked me about my boy, so I'm going to get to that. But I thought I would touch on that because, again, it shows that change in time of where I was growing up. Just
as an aside from that, Declan, because I do know, regardless of whether you're a Protestant or Catholic from back home, you always keep that kind of peer connection with the people you went to school with. There's a tightness that go. I think that's one of the reasons Derry Girls was successful, because anyone from back home would remember those things. For your friends who remain in the Brandywell, remain kind of back there, the sort of choice that you made there in terms of marriage, I would imagine that had been that's your choice, you're relaxed. Do you think for some of them that they could have came to a similar conclusion about meeting somebody, or would they just look at somebody and think, you come from a different school, religion background, it's just not going to work, or I don't really want it to work? Or so do you think if you hadn't moved away, do you think your mind would have taken you there?
That's a good question. Probably not. I don't know. Because I think, like we had said earlier, there's that, it's almost like this insular bubble. Although things are evolving back home, they're evolving, but they're still very much the same as well, in a strange way. So would I have considered if I didn't move away? Maybe not. Because one, I don't know if I would have had that same experience to actually meet someone from another faith, even though, going out in Derry, growing up in Derry, predominantly it was tribalistic. You kind of stuck to your groups, if that makes sense, even in the town. Yes. So you didn't go to certain bars. You certainly didn't. I mean, I remember whenever I used to go to Belfast, on the rare occasion, I would always have a pseudonym. So I'd have a different name, different school, different area that I loved, because it was always that, if you remember Professor Peter Taylor's idea of and theory of telling, you talked about it earlier. They'll ask you, if you don't answer what school you went to the right way. So it was like, what's your name? Dave, I don't know. Where did you grow up?
Short, yeah.
Mavadi, I'm still not too sure. What school do you go to? Do you know? It's just that box ticking. But I don't know if I would have. I think certainly moving away to Scotland for all the sectarianism that exists, and I think I don't want to say, I'm going to say it, and whether I'm right or wrong, then you can correct me. It's a different kind of sectarianism.
Yes, I agree. It's attitudinal a lot more way than structural. Because there is free. Like if you would, there would not be parts of Scotland that you would be worrying about going to with your name or things around those things. But there's parts of where we come from that if people don't know you, and people don't like. So I was doing a project recently in a lawyer's area, Tweddell Avenue in Shankill Road. The guy who was taking me around we were talking like a boxing club and things. He met me off the bus. I don't want you wandering around the shank on your own. That could be no reason, but he's like, I'll meet you. Someone knows who you are, and you're turning up to do it. So there's still that thing back at home where people, you need to be a known quantity. I think so. I think that's fair.
Dave, what a way to end it. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and I think that there's a lot of takeaways from what we've talked about today. And I think that the 3 Ps that you talked about and things for awareness. But ordinarily in this podcast, I'll end it by saying there's a tradition that we'll ask what are some of the things that you've done to take back control. But if you've actually rounded it off perfectly there with that example of that support, supporting others, supporting people around you, the institutional stuff, and how that everybody was able to walk taller that day by really recognising that we need to understand what sectarianism is, and that it's a hate crime. Probably maybe thinking about, I imagine, and integrating sectarianism policies within organisations as well, where that might be helpful. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Always good to have a friendly tone over the phone as well. So, but listen, thank you very much for joining me in session, and maybe we can do it again. Well, I might be there right enough, so I'll see you then. Thanks very much. Thank you for joining us on this episode of In Session Taking Back Control. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with anyone who might benefit from our discussions. For more resources and support, please visit us at Better You, and don't forget to tune in for another inspiring conversation. Until next time, take care and take back control.